Welcome to the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum. I'm Jim Ziegler, the Executive Director. Tonight we'll hear from Bob Holliday as the lecture series continues virtually. Bob grew up in Campbell, Ohio, outside Youngstown, where the first steel mill was shut down in the U.S. The Campbell Works of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. He worked in United Engineering and Foundry one summer as a vacation relief worker. After seeing the LUKENS rolling mill model, he realized that he was a helper on machining processes related to every piece of equipment in the mill, including the massive frames holding the rollers and the 30-foot-high double helix gears driving the rollers. Bob earned a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering at Ohio State University and an MBA at the University of Michigan. He worked in industry for over 30 years in operations management and organization and systems development roles, starting at Procter & Gamble 14 years, Scott Paper 10 years, Armstrong Flooring 5 years, plus some consulting. Bob enjoyed 10 years at the United Way of Chester County as a development director. In the last 10 years, he's pursuing the Brandywine Regeneration Project aimed at regenerating the spiritual heritage of our nation and democracy. Bob's lived in Chadds Ford for 40 years on what is now recognized as a Brandywine battlefield site. He's been married for 51 years with 3 kids and 5 grandkids, the oldest being 16. Please welcome Bob Holliday.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for asking me to make this presentation. I really appreciate it a lot, and I am here with a friend of mine named Silas Millwright, who's looking at me. It is one of the cutouts from that you see in the stadiums today, but it happens to be a perfect image for being here today because I'll be speaking about the importance of millwrights in the generation of our businesses. And I also welcome all the people who are at home, in your offices, in your rooms, or wherever you are. I welcome you here as well. And the subject of tonight is businesses along the Brandywine. And the perspective that I will provide is how the Brandywine, as you read the statement there, created the spiritual base of the United States. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. And got my little, just starting to learn this here. So the focus is also how this can be a source of rebirthing our nation. So the Brandywine, from a national heritage perspective, is considered the most powerful watershed in the country, heritage-wise, as I said. That so much happened on it in the generation of our nation that it's finally been recognized at the highest priority level as the battlefield, the most important battlefield site left in the nation to be protected. And 2 themes of the battlefield of the nation that we'll be bringing out that happened along the Brandywine was, first of all, the Brandywine was the savior of our nation. That the Battle of the Brandywine, we lost the battle, but we won the war. And it was key to the formation of the spirit of the patriots. When they left there, they knew they could win the battle, and that also that they could hold their own against the regulars from the British Army, which led to other countries in Europe joining to help bring about our independence. So while it demonstrated to people that we had the strength and the will and the determination to do that. It's also recognized as the cradle of innovation, that the amount of technology, the generation of technological improvements here and innovations revolutionized industries and generated industries in our country. So from both themes, the Brandywine was key in the formation of our country. And one more thought. If you go to the Brandywine River Museum, which is where that painting is, and you look in the eyes, closely in the eyes of the patriots, you can see their soul, and you could see the fierce determination that they held for what they were about. And we'll talk more about that. So today is an opportunity for creating a rebirth in our nation while that generative force of the Brandywine still potentially exists. So the purpose of the presentation tonight is education. Education from two perspectives. We want to learn about the role of the Brandywine as the spiritual source of our democracy and its businesses. And what does that mean? Secondly, we want to learn about the transforming of the power of the Brandywine in our lives and in our pursuits today. How do we bring that forward today? So it's not just looking back in history, it's looking at today and what the critical situations are that we face today. So what I plan to do is describe the evolution of life and businesses along the Brandywine as seen from the eyes of the Brandywine, starting with the LENNI-LENAPE Indians. And the perspective I will be taking is one of the heritage of the Brandywine, not the history. So it's a heritage it relates to the being and spirit of something, whereas history deals with the functional aspect. It deals with the dates and the times that events took place and the names of the people, and it's very critical. So it's not better or worse, they both go together. But then this, from the being and spirit standpoint, it's looking at why did that happen? So I'm not an historian and don't pretend to be one. I talked to Gene DiOrio, who is fabulous as a historian and somebody who's still around sharing his wisdom before giving this talk, and that was very helpful. So, and what I hope that this produces is that it stimulates you. It stimulates your imagination and dreams, and it helps you to form a vision of what we can pursue in today's world. Why this is important to us? For me, it's important for us to rejuvenate the indomitable hope of our founders. And as I use the word hope, hope is not an emotion. It's not an optimism or having a positive attitude. Hope is a force for good. It's a product of our will. And it's something that gives more force to what we're living about. We make that choice. Hope is a choice we make. We could live in a hopeless state or a state filled with hope. And that's what this is about. So how did we unfold the history here? And looking at the evolution and how the soul of our nation was brought about by the life of the Brandywine, this little chart here starts, we're going back with the LENNI-LENAPE Indians, which we'll talk about, and then the Swedes landed in 1638. Now, when did the LENNI-LENAPE Indians get here? They've been here for at least 20,000 years. And as I talked to my friend Chief Quiet Thunder, he says the recent carbon dating of footprints date back to 50,000 years ago. This is not to get into an argument on either one. Trust me that they were here thousands of years before any recorded history came to these shores. And so that's the starting point of the Brandywine, because that's where our history started, 1638 with the Swedes. Then along came the city of Wilmington, the Battle of the Brandywine, LUKENS, DuPont, and Howard Pyle Illustrative Art. Those are the 7 spots where, to me, are most significant along the Brandywine. That doesn't mean it's all of them, but it's ones I felt were most significant in terms of the generative force that they brought about. So how has the Brandywine been shaped by the spirit and motivation of the people as manifested in its businesses? That's what we're about to begin a journey on. So the first step of that is to say, well, what did the Brandywine cause in our country? You know, if you look at the quote on the right, National Geographic in the year 2013 had a whole section on the Brandywine. And it described the Brandywine and said that it was our founding river, that it powered technological revolutions, which really captures in a nutshell the core of the Brandywine. And what it did is it provided that capacity to capture and utilize power in order to drive technology. So the underline there is really important. It's responsible for creating a nation able to develop technologies that utilize natural resource power. Now, as we know right now, looking back on how we did that and how we're still doing that, the way we've developed technologies not only utilize natural resource power, it degrades them, and it in fact is really slowly destroying them. It is destructive in the way that we have currently developing our technologies, and that's the revolution of thinking and revolution of technologies that are being called for today, and that our country has a choice of stepping up to, and once again creating that in our country. So that today it can cause us to do that again, but at a different level, at a level that we're working in harmony with nature's processes and how nature regenerates itself. So the aim that I hope you would share is symbolized by the Liberty Bell in N.C. Wyeth. So if you picture that ringing again in your life, reawakening the spiritual heritage of our democracy along the Brandywine, where it really shines. It shines just so beautifully, such that we become a regenerated nation with a regenerated spirit. So that's our challenge, and that's what I believe that we're being called to. This chart shows in another way the Brandywine, just in its natural power. And the question is, what is the Brandywine? When we say the Brandywine, what is its essence? Every one of us, everything that exists here has an existence, but it also has an essence, that inner force. And the essence, as we have seen it with the group I was working on, is to be the spiritual source of the essence of democracy. That's what we're trying to bring about, is to bring that back to life in everything that we are creating and in our lives themselves. So let's take the journey and see what we can learn. The first step of the journey, as I said, is the LENNI-LENAPE. And their essence was to live, they saw everything that existed was a sacred obligation to care for and to care for it for future generations. It was not for me, it was for all of us, and also for those of us in the future that we know are coming after us. And that's how they lived their life. And hopefully the images convey that to you. And the quote from my friend Chief Quiet Thunder, I think beautifully describes how they lived their lives. He said, we didn't worship the sun, we worshiped the great creator spirit that created the sun. So their sacred obligation, they realized there's nothing that they saw here that they could create themselves. So that's what made it sacred. And that's how they viewed it. Their story of creation was symbolized in the symbol down at the bottom left of this. I'm trying to cover two different images. This symbol here was their story of creation, which I can't tell you as well as the chief can tell you, but it really is a story that resonates with a lot of our own beliefs here. But that's what led them to see everything as so sacred, and that's how they lived their lives. Now, if you look at what was the spirit of that, what was the generative force that they have left for us to live up to today, the next chart here is trying to symbolize that and also bring it out in the statement. What their life was about was to care for all who are present and all who someday may become present. Everything was in the community and was for the purposes of the community. Children from the age of 3 had roles for participating in the community. Everybody had a role where they started to learn, create something of value and create themselves in the process so they can contribute more value in the future. And during that time, they had no homelessness. Everybody had food and had productive work and constructive work and work that was valuable to the person doing it and valuable to the person. They lived by a principle called the 7-generation principle. And my friend the chief is writing a book called the 7-generation principle. Picture that. you know, my grandkids are the third generation from me. If I want to be able to carry that principle out, I have to think about 4 more generations after them. What are their kids going to see life as? What are they, and then they, 7 generations out. It's a very demanding principle, and one that they practiced in their lives, and one that we can learn from. We didn't learn from it at the time, but we can go back and learn from it now. Excuse me. By the way, I just also recently found out what was the Indians' name for the Brandywine, which was not the Brandywine, certainly. It was Wawasan. You know, the Wawas that are so predominant, but it was Wawasan. And I checked with the chief, and the meaning of that is wild river, not wild goose as the Wawa symbol, but the wild river. So the Brandywine was a wild river. So we've taken the wildness out of it for the most part, but we need to allow it to come back in the right kind of way. Another point for the Indians was that they were a very enterprising people. So we're here to talk about businesses along the Brandywine. It started really with the Indians. As you can see from the picture that I maybe went off too soon, you know, that they were always making something or creating something. They were always building something, and they traded with other tribes. The Brandywine was known more for the fertility of its soils and its foods, and the Susquehanna was for animal life. So there was a lot of trading back and forth to be able to feed themselves and do what they needed to do. And I just needed to make sure I'm covering the points I wanted to. So key is now, what's that mean for today? If going the wrong direction, if we were to care for all who are present, what could we start with today? What could we bring back? And recently I had a discussion with actually Tony Buck and Donna Sells from the Chamber. We were talking about a food hub and education center. It's a selection center for the purchase of foods good for the health and well-being of each person, and that educates people about healthy food selection, preparation, and healthy meals, and how to eat meals as a family. It's estimated as a new branch of medicine called lifestyle medicine. It's estimated 85% of diseases in our country today are caused by lifestyle, and the vast majority of them are caused by the foods that we eat. Good foods equal good health. And this could be a food hub and education center for bringing back and educating people about good diets in our lives and good foods. Next in the journey are the Swedes, and they came aboard, came to our country in 1638 on a ship named the KALMAR Nickel. And I love the quote from on the church there saying, "Light from on high shines in the darkness." That was really a theme of their coming to America, and what their essence was universal acceptance. You'll see that more as we went to it, but you could see in the images there that they didn't fight the Indians, they joined with them. They came here for economic freedom, and they quickly saw that the Indians could do things, make things that they couldn't make, and that they could sell over in Europe. And so from an economic standpoint, they joined with them and began to trade with them and to be able to sell their goods overseas. And they also recognized that for their creativity to continue to develop, they needed to practice their own religion the way they practiced it. And so religious freedom was also brought about at that time due to the realization on the Swedes' part that was key to develop the capacity of the person at that time. So the pictures really bring out that there was no weapons that they were pointing at each other. They had them there, but they were joining each other. The other part that was key for the Swedes was craftsmen, craft people of all variety. From a business standpoint, they came in, and as they grew and established themselves, they set up little shops in Wilmington. So Wilmington was filled with little skilled shops, individuals or groups of individuals, using their craft skills and selling their craft skills. And again, that was part of the business development along the Brandywine, was the flourishing craftsmen that came in and set up shops and helped to build our country at that level. Now, if you look at the spirit of the Swedes, wrong direction again, sorry about that. If you look at that picture there, that really brings out to me beautifully their spirit, which was be accepting of all walks of life and enable their manifestation of purpose and spirit. So that started to establish at that point a spiritual value of work that people were working on. And so that began really between the Swedes and the Indians, but then that was really brought alive quite a bit in the Wilmington area. So what could the Swedes be about today? If that was alive in our country, that spirit, that force, what could it be generating for us? And if you think about it, the craftsmen and the skills, it'd be a center for the development of marketable skills for people with underutilized or unused, or people that just want to advance themselves. Be a center for marketable skills that you could actually pay people to do that, but then they had a marketable skill they could go out and employ themselves and begin their own creating of things that we need for our society. And it's not just marketable skills for the jobs that exist, but what are the jobs we need today to deal with the issues that we're facing? And so it can be a great source of bringing back the marketable skills. They're at the source of generating our businesses. Next in our journey is Wilmington, and its essence was about altruistic entrepreneurialism. Altruistic entrepreneurialism, I'll work on that more. But I'd like to read to you the definition of altruism that I thought really fit what Wilmington was about. It's a principle, and altruism is a principle and moral practice of concern for happiness of other human beings, resulting in a quality of life, both material and spiritual. That's what took place in Wilmington, and that's what the city of Wilmington was about. And the quote there is also very instructive, and that again was from the National Geographic article. And it compared the Brandywine Valley to Silicon Valley. It said Brandywine Valley was to automation what Silicon Valley was to the computer, microprocessing. One thing that I think it's important to keep in mind, at that point in time, automation did not mean the elimination of people from jobs. At the time, and this was alive in our country to the point that I worked in industry back in '67, I mean, that in terms of the innovation and the automation of processes, the things that were brought in were meant to extend the capacity of people, not take the place of it and eliminate them. So that was a different form of automation, at least as I experienced it in Procter & Gamble when I worked there. In fact, I had a savings project that was going to pay off in 4 months, and I thought it was the greatest thing going. And the general manager said, he kicked me out of his office, really. He said, unless you come back and tell me how it's going to produce a quality product and develop your people, I won't approve it. So that was still alive in our country then, and our corporations, some of them, that's the best ones, really were still practicing that. So on the picture there, let's kind of get more out of the images there. On the bottom left, here was the first automated flour mill in our country, and that was generated along the Brandywine. And the person sitting here, the image of a person at a milling machine or a millwright, at least that's the closest I could get to it, was key to the formation of that automated flour mill. And it turns out the person's name was Martin Poole, who did this. And he worked on the milling process to produce a roller. It took him 1 year to produce a roller that was essential in the grinding process. He dedicated himself to perfect that to a point that that roller could allow the milling process to perfect the grains of flour to a level of grain that was desired in Europe, Brandywine Superfine. And that was produced by the flour mills that were along Wilmington, and that was the brand name, Brandywine Superfine, and it was the finest flour in the world. But it started with Martin Poole at the millwright working 1 year on one roll. And then after that, they were able to get it down to where it would take 2 or 3 days for the rolling, for the milling process to be able to produce a roll of that quality. So Silas, I thank you for the dedication to your craft and what you were able to create, because that was key to starting to bring about that level of perfection. A quote here says, it was the roll maker's work as art and science. It was performing upon ponderous iron as delicate work as a watchmaker's, or that employed by the finest scientific equipment. So this was a common example that in many different areas, individuals came, perfected what they were doing, and that was a source of generating a new industry. So let's look at what were the businesses that were generated along the Brandywine during that time. The ones that have, and I could have had a dozen charts of all the different industries, but in particular were shipbuilding rather. And this book here, I don't know if Sam can get it, but it's the city that launched 1,000 ships. Would you believe that up until the middle 50s or the 60s, more ships were being built in Wilmington than the rest of the country combined? So it had the shipbuilding industry, railroad car manufacturers, competed with Pullman. They had the first continuous rolling paper mill at Gilpin Mill. Metalworking industry, silversmithing. Silversmithing here was again exportable to Europe. Cotton milling, textile industry. All the products that were made, tanning was the finest in the world. All the products made were of exportable value that had distinctive value around the world. That was a key aspect of what was being done in Wilmington. Also in that picture, you'll see that there's Harriet Tubman and Thomas Garrett. And the question is, okay, now how did they fit into the industrialization that was going on? Well, the enslaved Africans came here for work and for freedom, and so they were a source of valuable labor to the industries, and they were admired for their skills, for their determination, and for their strength. And that led to the growth of many of our industries, including here in Coatesville at LUKENS. At a talk once at LUKENS, I found out that there were 1,000 African American workers employed at LUKENS in the year 1900. So at the start of the 1900s, there were 1,000 African American workers here. And a comment by Skip Houston, who was the last family member who was the CEO, Charles Lukens Houston, made the statement that they enabled the growth of LUKENS, that it would not have happened elsewhere. So it was very powerful to forming the industries along the Brandywine and then further on, as you know, in Detroit and around the country. Now, the spirit of Wilmington to me was symbolized best by the picture there, which was to enable man to develop his potential self through his work. Again, it was bringing out the spiritual value of work. Work was a source of self-regeneration, not cheap labor. To be able to create something of value for the community and nation and to become more valuable in the process was a virtue for people that they deeply honored. And Wilmington was recognized as the creativity capital of our nation at that time. So what could they do today? Well, back to the foods, and the foods that are not generating health for us is the development of health-generating foods and fooding processes that are good for the body, soul, and spirit, not just our bodies. We have to be feeding all parts of us to really be healthy. And that's, to me, a key innovation that force could bring about in the city of Wilmington. So the people growing the food are also growing their spirits. So it's not just how do we mechanize it down to the point that there's no human growth and no human interference in their growing, and then we can better understand the holistic growing processes. Next in the, we're doing on time, okay. Next in the flow of history came the Battle of the Brandywine, which took place September 1st, September 11th, I slipped and told you my birthday. September 11th, 1777 is when the battle came about. And I'd like to read to you the poem that's on the left there in the red, if you can't read it from there. And because to me it's a very, very powerful statement of what was captured on the Brandywine. This plaque is at Valley Forge, and so as you know, the troops retreated from the Brandywine to Valley Forge, spent the winter there. And here in the place of sacrifice, in this vale of the shadow, of that death out of which the life of America rose, regenerate and free. Let us believe with an abiding faith that to them liberty, union will seem as dear, and liberty as sweet, and progress as glorious as they were to our fathers and are to you and me, and that the institution which made us happy, preserved by the virtue of our children, shall bless the remotest generation of the time to come. And the title on the page, that might be hard to read, is it's a military history of the battle that lost Philadelphia but saved America. And you probably know that when they captured Philadelphia, it was a hollow victory because our government had escaped to out in the Lancaster area and then went on from there to other areas. But they were able to continue governing the country. And I'd like to bring out that I'm going to read something here from a magazine that identified from the American Battlefield Trust and the North American Land Trust have both given the Brandywine battlefield its highest priority in our nation, and they're recently buying 72 acres at $38 million, which shows how it's important to be recognized. And their statement is that at the Brandywine, the Continental Army under General George Washington proved that it could hold its own against British regulars in an all-day stand-up fight. Other powers in Europe took notice, helping forge the alliance that led to the American independence. And it was the largest battle of the Revolutionary War. So it was very significant in our nation's history. And actually a little aside, if you go to the Battlefield Park in Chadsford, the deed there was misread by a factor of 10. So it's roughly 67 acres. It should be 670 acres, more the size of Valley Forge. Little dot there they missed. So what is the spirit that we need to bring forth today from that battle? And it's captured in that statement, we the people, not them, not they, not the government. If you look at that picture by Howard PYLE, they were not looking to the government in their eyes to solve anything. They were looking in their souls. And what the idea was, they left the battle saying that the idea that they were pursuing was more powerful than any army in the world. And the idea was inculcating the belief that government was of the people, by the people, for the people, and that spawned the Constitution. Something to reflect on. Now we're on to LUKENS, home here. And I'm sure you know more about that than I do. So I got a little bit ahead of my papers here. The essence, to me, as I looked at it, of LUKENS was eternal hope. I read a quote from Rebecca LUKENS that really told me that. On one of the letters that were written, I think it was a letter to her daughter, might have been some other letters, that when she was asked, why did you take over the mill, a woman, run it for over 20 years? She said, I looked into the eyes of the workers, and I knew then that they depended on me for their families and their futures. I knew I could not let them down. That's a powerful statement. And also very powerful is in the quote. Her quote was, that in 1834 they had completely remodeled and rebuilt the mill. Who rebuilt it? The people in the mill. It was not outside consultants that came in to do it. And the whole metallurgy field was then formed in this area, which Lukens came to dominate through the technological innovations and creative spirit of its workers, demonstrating, again, a quote, the greatest care and attention to making the best, no better on the market. And if you look at the major industries that were able to profit from it, the locomotive industry, if you think of boilers were blowing up at that time and they were not considered safe to rise on, and Lukens produced the first seamless boiler. And that allowed the whole locomotive industry to expand across our whole country. And they were making plates in this mill that no one in the world could make. Now some people can make it, but at that time no one in the world could make, and became a source of our national security in our ships and battlefields, and all the way to the point that the trees, as they're called, that were still standing from the World Trade Center came from Coatesville, because no other alloys in the country had the strength to form the first 9 floors of the World Trade Center. And also in terms of how did that come about, what I have pictured down here is about a 30-foot high, at least 30-foot high, drying drum for the paper industry. And again, talking to Skip, he told me about the fun of running the steel mill when you were always creating something new. He talked about going to the paper industry and saying, what would you need to be able to evolve your paper making process to another level? Think of that question. And then they would come back and create the alloys that would enable them to do that. So he was selling something they couldn't now create, but he knew that the workers had the capacity to create it. And they had a metallurgy research lab here for doing that. So from a business standpoint, the locomotive railroad industry, as I mentioned, shipbuilding, military businesses, national security, power generating industry. You can see the nuclear power symbol there. There was a point in time that if you were going to build a nuclear power plant, you had to get steel from here for some portion of the process. So the key there was also, as you can see from the Skip statement, it was market driven. It was not just to improve efficiency and cost, it was market driven. What would create greater value in the market and for customers? And that generated the creative spirit of people. So, taking a little bit, but it's worth it, it's long here. What was the spirit of Lukens about? And this to me is the most powerful image on all this whole slide. People with locked arms sitting around the globe. That's the image that we need to work toward. And the spirit of Lukens was about work should be directed toward the common good of all the living systems. Common good, meaning what's needed to enable the growth and development of all living things, both human and in nature. That's what's needed today. Living systems, again from Skip, putting water back into the Brandywine cleaner than they took it out. That was their challenge, and we can continue with that challenge of looking at how do we bring back that wild river and bring back the creative spirit that was generated around it. It's not just about the water, because we're not separate from the water. It's the water and what it generated. So what could that create today? For me, what comes to my mind is what I would title a living materials design center. Today we're using materials that last 450 years as one-time throwaways. What kind of sense does that make? As Chief Python says, how could you be so stupid? And we're designing things for their obsolescence, not for their eternal value, not for their regenerative value. Can we see the regenerative value of what we're producing? And, think of that 7-generation principle. So that takes a different way of thinking than we're putting into design today. So this can be a source of regenerating that living material design center. And that would be a source of also bringing back a lot of new creative enterprises and entrepreneurs, which is what we need to bring about each of the ones that I mentioned. So, moving on to DuPont. DuPont was the 6th point along the Brandywine, pretty close in time to LUKENS, and what their essence was about was a noble duty that E.I. DuPont, pictured there, when it was part of the aristocracy in France, and his family was facing the threats of the revolution in France, and he came here, but his dad said before he left, you have a noble obligation. You are given much, you now have to give back much. And that's how he came here and started building his mill, and that was his motivation. You know, what he was about was to develop the soul of the person. He was looking at developing their inner spirit and will, and he saw that that would overcome all obstacles. And he actually died disappointed that he wasn't able to do that better than he did. But at one point in its history, it was the largest enterprise in the entire world. They owned General Motors. During World War II, they were responsible for designing, building, operating the production of plutonium for atomic bombs because they knew more about hazard management. They learned the hard way by mills blowing up and killing people, and they eventually mastered the science of managing hazards better than anybody in the world. And again, the milling process, as you could see, the brand of the gunpowder was superfine. But it was superfine, it was milled to the grain that fit your purpose. So it wasn't just one size fits all. What were you going to do? And they would mill something to fit that purpose perfectly. But long about the time that they continued to do that, someone, the head of research, came to Lamont DuPont at that time and convinced them that the company needed to pursue a totally new strategy, which was to create new sciences that don't exist, and direct their research that direction, not just direct it towards improving the efficiency and effectiveness of processes. And they saw the magic of the research and manufacturing integration. And they came to the belief that we in DuPont can create innovations to create solutions to any issue facing society. And that led to the innovation of nylon, which came about and started their theme of better things for better living through chemistry. But the story of nylon, you know, at that time silk was being used for stockings, and it had become extremely expensive and most women could not afford it. And then during the war there was no silk available, and nylon was being directed toward the war efforts for parachutes and things like that. So they dedicated all their products to being able to support the United States in the war. So after the war, there was an article about the nylon riots. It was like when the iPhones and the Apple was introducing new products and the way people crowded. Macy's had people crowding around in the same way for the nylon stockings, but enough on that. But it led to textiles and high-tech clothing of today as far as businesses. Another business that DuPont developed was electronics for automobile industry that led to driverless cars today. Paints for the automobile industry. Fibers of all kinds of Kevlar, Nomex, Tyvek that you might have heard about. They go into construction businesses, manufacturing businesses, safety businesses. So all those fibers helped to spur all those businesses. You know, so it was a second tier effect. It created new industries from that standpoint, making gloves that you couldn't cut through, making fire protective equipment no fire could touch. Kevlar was this absolutely most shock absorbent material in the world, and that changed industries. It led to developing new industries. So they were real generators of that. So the DuPont spirit, which I've captured here, is the most complex of all the statements. And you have to really kind of absorb it. But if you look at a key statement there, it's to see our salvation and glorification. What do we take glory in today? And what do we see is going to save us today? just the next day, or it's taken a longer term view of what our life is about in the emulation and evolution of creation processes. So if you look at emulating creation processes, the creation processes of the world have to do with the earth. Isn't it about creating us in water and air and fire? Those four basic elements of all living organisms on our earth, in terms of how do we emulate them and not conflict with them, would be a key opportunity for us. And that's what the new science of wholeness would need to bring about. And so to me, what would that create today is clean energy. We're pursuing driverless cars, we ought to be pursuing pollution-free cars. Clean energy as it's generated in a tree, emulating photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the source of all energy. We're taking from it, from the oil in the ground or natural gas or whatever we're doing, comes from photosynthesis. Emulating the photosynthesis as it's generated in a tree as a living system. Creating a science that can do that would make a significant difference in our world, and would be a worthy investment of our time and energy. Last spot it's taken a little bit longer, but is Howard Pyle. Howard Pyle was the first illustrative artist in our nation. A lot of people know the name Wyeth. Howard Pyle taught N.C. Wyeth, but the source of art in this world came about through Howard Pyle, and he was all focused. His essence was animating souls of whatever you were painting, of the person, of any scene had a soul to him, and the purpose of art was to animate the soul of what you were trying to paint. And a quote that is is it there, or it's on the next chart? The next chart was a quote from Van Gogh saying that he doesn't know who this artist is, who this Pyle is, but that his art is inspiring him every day. And what he essentially did was he took flat, static, and staged art and brought it to life. If you look at all of his paintings, they're living. They pop out at you. And he did that so much that the printing presses could not print it. And so he generated the whole printing industry, printing technology, and advancing the printing technology. And also the art became so much in demand that the books that were written or the magazines that it was shown in had to be translated in different languages, and it was shipped around the world. That's how Van Gogh heard about it. So it went around the world, and because of the art being so lively. And so Pyle was also a stimulator of industries in our country, very much so. And he was an author as well of many books, so he also stimulated the actual publishing of his own through the books. The little known part about himself is down in the left here. And you can't read it there, but it says DuPont Institute of Art, Science, and Industry in Philadelphia. And the School of Illustration, Howard Pyle was the director of it. And the statement there, he applied to one of his pirates, but it really applies to him. He was a man who knew his own mind and what he wanted. And in terms of the kind of students that he brought over 160 students. 1/3 of them were women. That was unheard of at that time. What he required, though, was fierce determination, because he knew that they were going to have to have that because of his teaching process, because he realized, and he spent the whole first year teaching people about their mind. He talked about the mind, not art. That he said, if you can't paint the soul of what you're painting, you can't paint. And he said to Howard Pyle, one of his quotes, all of his archives are at Delaware Art Museum. He said a quote to N.C. Wyeth during one of his sessions, you have too many thoughts in that painting. It's confusing. A great painting can only handle one great thought. Think about that. So it's a combination of art, science, and industry. And one of my favorite people to read is a person by the name of David Bohm, a renowned physicist, Nobel laureate, took over from Einstein. He talked about the relationship, essential relationship between art and science. He said both have a need to understand the totality of something, to see the living harmony and beauty of its harmoniously ordered structural relationships. Once they see that, then they go down separate paths. One to paint that and bring it to life in a painting, the other to bring it to life in new scientific insights and technologies. So when we eliminate art, we eliminate a mind, and that's what we need to bring back. And that's why, to me, what it could serve today is to generate the Brandywine School of Living Systems, so we could open up our minds to see the livingness of life around us and see how that can be a source of generating a lot of new businesses and innovations and creative enterprises and entrepreneurs in our country once again. So what's the hope of all this? Appreciate your patience in going through this. Whoops. So the picture, I'm sorry about I skipped over that for Howard Pyle. Picture the person in the center here, which is again one of my favorite pictures of him, is Thomas Jefferson crafting the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. And if you look down here, all the ruffled papers. It wasn't a one-time deal. It was just continuing to perfect what he was writing. But if you look at those scenes there, you know, if you ever feel like you've been marooned, that picture on the left there, to me, just really conveys it, the feeling of being marooned. So what I'd like to leave you with is, what's the hope of all of this? The hope is that a reawakening of the spiritual heritage of our democracy along the Brandywine can once enlighten us and be the spiritual source for regenerating the creative potential and spirit of persons and of our enterprises, aimed at creating a more ideal and sacred way of living for all living things, such that a revolution of freedom and opportunity is manifested in the world today, for which the founders of our great democracy sacrificed their lives. So thank you again for watching, for holding, and hopefully for digesting and joining in this spirit and joining in our own ways of being able to contribute to what our country needs to be about and what we need to be about in our own lives. Thank you.